So good morning and welcome back, everybody. Congresswoman Linda Sánchez, Vice Chair of the Democratic Caucus. The President's been doing a lot of tweeting while Congress has been out of session, and there's a lot of work that we have yet to get done for the American people. Republicans like to say that they are forging a better way, but the Republican so-called better way is turning out to be, sadly, the wrong way for America's working families. This week, we're talking about handouts to Wall Street. Last week, they went after the environment and the green jobs economy. And I think the week before that, they talked about taking away health care for 23 million Americans. Republicans seem to be singularly focused not on how to make the lives of everyday Americans better, but how to improve the wealth for corporations and make wealthy individuals' lives better. This week, the House is going to vote on the Choice Act, or as I like to refer to it, the Wrong Choice Act. Donald Trump and the Republicans, quite simply, want to dismantle Wall Street reform and consumer protections. They want to destroy all of the protections that were put into place after the disaster that led to the Great Recession. Let's all remember that it was Wall Street, not Main Street, that almost sent the global economy into another Great Depression. And I just want to take a moment to remind everybody what we were dealing with in the financial meltdown. Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, there were retirees who lost everything when the economy collapsed almost overnight, and people lost their homes. During the mortgage crisis, my office was inundated with thousands of phone calls and families who came to our doorstep fighting for a way to keep their home. Sadly, many of them were not able to do so. And people, after that experience, demanded that we never allow Wall Street to do this again. Real people were hurt by the greed and the recklessness of Wall Street, and those people are still trying to recover today. And what do the Republicans want to do? Now they want to get rid of all the protections to prevent that kind of thing from ever happening again. I don't think that going back to the greed, fraud, and dishonesty is the better way for this country. And with that, I am pleased to introduce a colleague of mine, Denny Heck, to have the floor for a few minutes. Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Congresswoman Sánchez. It was the great American philosopher George Santayana who once said, and I paraphrase, "Those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat its mistakes." And that's exactly what we're on the precipice here as we confront the Choice Act, or as we like to call it, the Wrong Choice Act. I looked through this bill, obviously, and read it, and one of the most consistent themes is getting soft on financial crime and abuse. It strips the CFPB of much of its enforcement power. It restricts SEC investigations. It makes it much harder to use FIREA, which I remind you was one of the most effective tools in punishing financial fraud in the crisis. My question is this, and I keep asking people this, I don't have an answer to this yet. Who is calling for us to have less investigating of financial fraud? Where's that coming from? Who is saying we need less investigation of financial fraud? If you're in the grocery store or services on Sunday or at a movie, does anybody actually ever run into anybody that says, hey, I know what we need less investigation of financial fraud or insider trading? This bill says SEC can only bring actions for financial abuses that are specified in the statute. Insider trading is not. It's judge-made law. So this bill says SEC can no longer prosecute insider trading. Who's calling for that? Who do we run into that says, hey, let's have less investigation of insider trading? Congressman Himes, my colleague from Connecticut, actually pressed this issue really hard in the markup on the Wrong Choice Act, but we didn't get any clear answers. In fact, we didn't get any answers at all. So I ask again, who is calling for less prosecution of insider trading? And frankly, what are their reasons? Or an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. The Dodd-Frank Act set up at CFPB an office to protect service members. And that office, which was actually managed initially by Holly Petraeus, has done a great job and educating and fighting for service members and their families. I care about this. I have 55,000 people that each day report to work at Joint Base Lewis McChord. And I know the good that the Office of Service Members Affairs at CFPB has done for them. Among all the other changes to CFPB in the Wrong Choice Act, this bill makes the office optional. It makes it optional, and it specifically strips it of the funding for financial counseling. Why? Who in our constituency says our men and women in uniform need fewer financial protections? Who is saying that? We don't have any answers to these questions, frankly, because I don't think there are any answers to these questions. This bill makes no sense to me. It not only completely forgets all the lessons of the 2008 crisis. 11 million people lost their homes. 13 trillion in net worth was wiped out. Our unemployment rate skyrocketed to 10%. It makes our system of financial regulation worse in ways that no one is asking for.
Now I'm pleased to present great colleague, Mr. Kildee.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda and Denny. So I'm the vice-ranking member, the second Democrat on the committee, on the Financial Services Committee. We went through a markup of this so-called Wrong Choice Act. If anyone thought that this legislation was a thoughtful, bipartisan attempt to try to deal with the real problems that we do see and that we obviously need to work on in the financial sector, you're sadly mistaken. This is not a bill that deals with some of the problems that we see in smaller banks. We have ideas on that subject. This is a highly partisan, hyper-ideological piece of legislation that takes us back to where we were, to the very same conditions that led to the financial crisis in the first place. It completely eviscerates the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, takes away all of its authority to deal with unfair and deceptive practices, basically takes away any of the teeth that the Consumer Bureau has to go to bat for the American consumer. Eliminates an important provision of Dodd-Frank, and that is orderly liquidation authority. Essentially puts us back in the position that we were in before the financial crisis, where the only way to deal with a failing institution is to push it into bankruptcy and let investors, borrowers, consumers, and the American economy take its chances, rather than use a far more orderly process intended to minimize the negative impact that a failure could have on the economy. It ties the Fed's hands in making decisions about monetary policy, implementing essentially an automated formulaic system of determining interest rates so that the thoughtful approach that the Federal Reserve has been able to take to help manage the economy would be significantly weakened. And I don't think anyone could argue that is a step in the right direction, unless somehow you think that a thoughtless approach to this, an automated approach to managing monetary policy, makes sense. It rolls back the Volcker Rule, basically allows those big institutions to go back to the day where they could gamble with depositors' money for their own benefit, knowing that it was the federal government that was ensuring their investing strategies. They're gambling with the depositors' money. Makes no sense at all. This is one of those pieces of legislation that should be dead on arrival in the House. It ought not pass. Democrats were united in committee. It was all of the Democrats voted against this piece of legislation. We offered thoughtful amendments that we thought would improve the bill. We had a long list of amendments. We got through 19 of them. Not a single one was given a single vote from a single member on the Republican side, including, just for example, a very thoughtful amendment offered by Mr. Scott of Georgia that would simply have us, as a Congress, try to address the particular needs of unbanked individuals. Non-controversial. But because it was offered by a Democrat, they did not want to accept a single idea offered from any Democratic members of the committee. I know Mr. Heck offered an amendment that I think that dealt with the issues, as he pointed out, related to military members who have been the subject of predatory activity by financial institutions. Not even a thought that an amendment like that would be accepted. So, you know, process is kind of boring. I get that. But it's the only opportunity we have ever to try to do anything in a bipartisan fashion. This is an ideological bill that puts the economy at risk, takes us back to the conditions we were under. It led to the financial crisis, and it's a direction we ought to avoid. With that, I'm sure we'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you again to Dan Kildee and Denny Heck for joining me today, and we will open it up for questions. Yes.
One of your colleagues, Al Green, says that he's now working on articles of impeachment for the president. That's just one member. We hear this chatter of the I word the past few weeks here. Do you get a sense among House Democrats that there is a movement afoot, or is this just one member, and is Mr. Green maybe out over the tips of his skis too far?
Well, I can't speak for every member of the Democratic caucus. I know that there are, we share the concerns about the daily information that we receive about the investigation into Russian ties, potentially with the Trump campaign and administration. I think the overwhelming sentiment of the caucus, and I could be wrong, again, I don't speak for the entire caucus, is that folks are waiting to have the process conclude. They're continuing to watch the investigation. They want that to come to a conclusion, and they want to see the facts before coming to any conclusion.
But is that the issue where you think maybe it would be better? I mean, you say you get the sense that it might be better to wait till the process goes out there, but some people are going to see Mr. Green's press conference today and then lump all Democrats and say they're just trying to stick it to the president when the investigation is not complete.
Again, you know, I can only speak for my personal views, and I think that a majority of the caucus is of the belief that we ought to allow the investigation to continue to its logical conclusion before making any determination. Other questions? Yes.
On the Choice Act, it doesn't seem like this has a great chance of becoming law, just given the numbers in the Senate, the record of getting anything through the Senate. Do you see this as just a message to regulators in terms of what they can get away with, what they should be focusing on? What do you see as the actual intent of the bill that's probably going to pass? And then,
Dan, do you want to?
I think, you know, you raised a very good point. Denny and I served on the committee now for going on 5 years, and we often do scratch our heads because very often the bills that are brought are ideological bills that most analysis would say have no chance of becoming law. But we worry about this. We worry about the message that the majority on the committee and ultimately the majority in the House is trying to send, because the message is pretty clear. If you're to read this bill, the message to regulators is to back off. Back off. Basically let these institutions go back to the day when they could do whatever they wanted to do. And the consumer was really of no consequence. That's what led to the financial crisis in the first place, that people were taken advantage of. And so whether this becomes law or not, when the President of the United States, who supports this legislation, issued a SAP, I think, yesterday, and the majority in the Congress says to the regulators, we think you're doing too much. You shouldn't really be standing up for these consumers. Whether this bill ever becomes law or not, it's a pretty cynical message that's being sent, and it's one that ought to be rejected. I don't know, Denny, if you have.
Yes.
What do you think of the administration's directive not to provide information, basically to Democrats, if you request information from them without Republicans on board, without the support of the full committee? I know members of the Oversight Committee were challenging this and requesting stuff on Trump's international hotel.
Yeah, it's pretty concerning because as committees attempt to do their work and their oversight, it's pretty routine for members of committees to send requests for information to federal agencies or to the White House, and the fact that they're not willing to consider those requests at all unless there are Republicans who sign off on that, signals that they're not really interested in working with all of Congress to provide information that is relevant and that is helpful for us to do our work here. And I find that particularly concerning. Yes, Denny?
May I add? It's cynical and it's wrong. And importantly, it's part of a broader pattern of the darkness with which this administration is progressing toward. Removing access to visitor logs, threatening to cut off daily briefings, failure to keep with modern American history and disclose his tax returns. He's heading toward increasing darkness. Sunlight's the best disinfectant, and unfortunately, he is slowly but surely shutting out the sunlight.
What do you think of Republicans' unwillingness to sign on to something like that, just pure simple disclosure stuff?
I find it interesting because they operate in the majority, and they seem to be collaborators in this idea of reducing transparency. It signals to me that they're not really interested in having robust discussions based on factual information, that they are more loyal to party at times than they are loyal to the United States and the best interests of the United States of America. Yes.
Follow up on Matt's question, building on that, the president's son last night, Eric Trump, did an interview and said that he didn't think Democrats were, quote, not even people. You have the president coming out with an infrastructure proposal this week. That's something that he initially said that he wanted to work with Democrats on. You have the debt ceiling coming up, the debate. Does this environment contribute to something that you could address those issues in a bipartisan way? I mean, is there a willingness from Democrats to come to the table on something like infrastructure and the debt ceiling?
I will say that at the beginning of his term, we were absolutely willing to work with them on issues of common ground. Democrats were very interested in talking about an infrastructure bill. But each day that passes, we see this complete shutting out of one side of Congress. It's almost as if, in their viewpoint, what we have to contribute is not relevant. So as we've walked down this path and we've seen them jam wholly ideological and party-driven pieces of legislation like their health care bill and their tax plan, which they're writing in a room with no input or dialogue with Democrats, it becomes increasingly harder to say that we can sit down and work with them when we're never invited to the table. It makes the environment extremely challenging. And there are things that our country needs. There are challenges that we really need to get our hands dirty on and try to fix because the status quo is increasingly untenable. And yet their reluctance to even consider Democratic amendments to a bill that could make it a better bill, or to even ask us to come in and sit at the table and discuss these issues, means that they're wholly uninterested in what we have to say. And if they believe that a majority of America wants to see these kinds of policies pursued, policies that hurt consumers, that hurt workers, that hurt American families, they'll, there are consequences to the work that they produce, and hopefully we'll see in 2018 a rejection of this increasingly cavalier attitude of we can go it alone. Interestingly, the only time that they come to Democrats is when their own caucus is so fractured that they cannot govern, and then they come and beg us for support. And we are starting to see that chatter on the debt ceiling. I mean, they control everything, and yet they seem fundamentally unable to govern. It is their responsibility to govern. And yet we are only consulted when they are in such disarray that they can't even perform the most basic of government functions.
Yeah, I think if I could just comment on that. This is one of those moments of truth, I think, for Republicans in Congress to do their job and to not act as if they are in the bleachers for the President of the United States. They have a job to do, and they need to step up and do it. It's becoming increasingly difficult for us to imagine how we could work with this president on something as vital to all of us as infrastructure because, and I don't think I'm making any news here, you cannot depend on what the President of the United States says. And so it's really difficult to imagine entering into significant discussions with him about how to structure an infrastructure bill when long-standing allies can't trust his word. Republicans in Congress can't trust his word. Even his own staff are contradicted by him on a daily basis. You can't trust the word of the President of the United States. And so it's very difficult to negotiate with somebody like that. So it's a moment of truth for Republicans in Congress to decide that their loyalty to the people they work for, to the Constitution, to this country, has to come before simply being in a position of carrying the water for a president who is unstable.
Follow up on the debt ceiling, you guys touched on this, they're likely gonna need Democratic votes, especially after Mnuchin said yesterday that, they're gonna pursue a clean debt ceiling. And if you say it's like the moment of truth for them, is this the time for Democrats to get out of the way and vote no on a debt ceiling hike just to force Republicans to come up with their own votes, or do you think you guys will bail them out again?
Interesting question. Secretary Mnuchin came to meet with members of, Democratic members of the Ways and Means Committee, and the first issue out of the box that he wanted to talk about was raising the debt ceiling. And we looked at him sort of in puzzlement and wonderment and said, "You're preaching to the wrong choir, my friend. You should be carrying that message to the Republican caucus." I think it is time to step aside for the moment and see how they can govern and whether they can govern responsibly. Again, they have the majority. The responsibility is on their shoulders to keep the basics of government open and running. And I think it's hard to predict where Democrats will be until we know whether or not they have enough adults in the room to complete the business that needs to get done. Yes.
Following quickly, do you see the debt limit vote as a way to get cost sharing, which Republicans, of course, the president said he was going to provide it, then he backed off, and you see insurers making decisions based on the president's fickleness on this. Is that something that when is the pivot point where you could get cost sharing funded?
We're not sure what the debt ceiling bill will look like because we don't know what faction within their party or what faction within the president's advisors, what the ultimate shape of that will be. So again, it's hard to predict just where Dems will land depending on what they propose and what they put forward. It's hard to speculate. Any other questions?
Do you feel used when if they come to you in that circumstance, the idea unless there is something in return? I mean, I understand the importance of responsibility to the country, and the debt ceiling is such a serious issue. But the idea that, they never provided any votes for anything that the Democrats did when they were the majority. And then they come with hat in hand?
Would you feel used if somebody didn't call you until and unless they really needed something important from you?
But how do you balance that with the responsibility of the country versus what is the right thing to do, and then saying, well, wait a minute, why are you coming to us?
Well, I think Democrats always keep in mind that what is good for the country is what is best overall. And let me correct a misperception that we are wishing failure upon the president. We do not wish failure upon the president because we don't wish failure upon this country. We hope for success. So we hope that the dysfunction and the chaos and the multiple positions and the changing of positions, we hope that gets corrected so that we can do productive things for this country. But yeah, it's a little hard not to feel like you're being taken for granted when you're not invited in to talk about any major policy issue that they are, pursuing until there's something that's dire and desperate that they need your help with. Our message all along has been, you have to govern responsibly. There are, all of us represent the same number of constituents in this country. We all have the best interests of our constituency in mind, and we all have different perspectives. But you might be surprised if you actually invited us in and actually not just put window dressing on wanting to work together, but actually listen to our ideas, that we might actually have some pretty great ideas that would help move our country forward in a way that is positive for everybody. All right, with that, we are concluded. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Linda. Oh, yeah. We'll recycle this.
Good job, guys.